Hello, welcome to Hour in Africa with me, Jean-Emile Jamin, taking a look at all the latest news from across the continent, starting with these headlines. The DR Congo's President Felix Tshisekedi says the peace deal with Rwanda paves the way for a new era of stability. Monday's comments come 3 days after the historic accord signed in Washington, but reactions have been mixed. We'll take a look. Then at least 7 people died in anti-government protests in Togo's capital, Lomé, amidst reports of brutal crackdowns. The government has denied deaths are linked to unrest, but rights groups have condemned the violence. And new US sanctions against Sudan's government have taken effect, a response to allegations that Khartoum's military used chemical weapons in the brutal civil war against the Rapid Support Force paramilitary. Welcome to the show. It's been 3 days since the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda signed a historic deal aiming to end the M23 conflict in eastern Congo. Reactions to the deal in Congo have been mixed, with some people skeptical that it will change much on the ground. The country's president, Felix Tshisekedi, promises that it's a step towards peace, adding it paves the way for a new era of stability. Emmett Livingston in Kinshasa reports.
Scarce.
Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi on Monday hailed the recent peace agreement he struck with Rwanda. This was the first time that Tshisekedi has mentioned the deal, which was signed on June 27th. In a televised address, he thanked US President Trump for brokering the talks and said that they would lead to peace in eastern Congo. The aim is to end the 3-year conflict with the M23 rebel group, which Rwanda has backed with thousands of its own troops. Rwanda is meant to withdraw those troops under the deal, and both sides are meant to stop support for non-state armed actors.
This agreement isn't just a document, it's a promise of peace for the people of Goma, Bakuvu, Lubero, Ituri, and all the localities martyred by war. This diplomatic process is also linked to the discussions underway in Doha. Our ambition remains unequivocal: to fully re-establish the authority of the state over the entire national territory and to work towards establishing real, lasting and shared peace throughout the sub-region.
There's also scepticism that the deal will change the situation on the ground, as the M23 has never officially recognised previous agreements between Congo and Rwanda. Observers and some residents in Goma have expressed fears that the peace deal may be merely symbolic. The front lines in eastern DRC have been mostly stable since February, but conflict continues between M23 fighters and myriad local militias which carry out guerrilla attacks.
Moving on, and tensions are running high in Kenya after days of deadly protests and shocking scenes of police violence. Authorities say nearly 500 people have been arrested following last week's unrest, demonstrations that spiraled into what the government calls an attempted coup. That violence left at least 19 dead and over 500 injured, including multiple reports of sexual violence. In the latest grim development, a young man shot at close range by police during the protests has died, reigniting anger over police brutality. Rights groups are calling for accountability as the government vows to track down those behind the chaos. Police, though, have also had their say.
Today, 485 individuals have been arrested in connection to what happened on June 25th. The charges range from murder, terrorism, rape, gang rape, arson, obstruction of police officers while on duty, breaking and stealing, robbery and as well robberies with violence, stealing from locked motor vehicles, incitement to violence, handling stolen goods, malicious damage to property, and possession of illegal firearms.
To the bulge of Africa now, Togo's capital Lomé is reeling after a wave of rare anti-government protests left at least 7 people dead and dozens wounded. Civic groups say the bodies were pulled from rivers following 3 days of demonstrations against rising prices, repression of dissent and constitutional reforms strengthening President Faure Gnassingbé's grip on power. Authorities deny the deaths are linked to the unrest, insisting they resulted from drowning. But rights groups are calling the government's response unacceptable, accusing security forces and militias of brutality.
Des éléments des forces de l'ordre et de sécurité.
The security forces, who are supposed to protect the public, and maintain order acted in collusion with thugs, lawless, violent men at the service of the regime. And they unleashed brutal, deadly repression instead of acting like professionals in charge of public safety.
Now to some fresh news. In Tunisia, a prominent critic of President Kais Saied has been sentenced to 2 years in prison. Lawyer Sonia Damani was handed the sentence on Monday over statements condemning the country's treatment of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa. A veteran Tunisian advocate, political commentator and media personality, she's often been seen on outlets such as IFM Radio and Carthage Plus TV. Damani is recognized as an outspoken figure on contentious issues, particularly migration, prison conditions and governance. This Monday, though, her legal team walked out of the trial, accusing the court of double jeopardy. It's the latest in a growing crackdown on dissent as Saied tightens his grip on power. The United States has officially imposed tough new restrictions on Sudan, targeting arms sales, financial transactions, and key exports to Khartoum's military-led government. The measures follow reports earlier this year that Sudan's armed forces deployed chemical weapons in their brutal conflict with the powerful paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. Clemence Voller takes a look.
In a statement published on June 27th, Washington announced its sanctions against the Sudanese authorities have taken effect. According to the notice published in the Federal Registry, the United States plans to stop all arms sales to the Sudanese government, reduce access to U.S. government loans, halt the export of advanced technologies to Sudan, and limit all U.S. exports to Sudan with the exception of agricultural products and emergency humanitarian aid. According to some analysts, the impact of these sanctions on the war-torn country will be limited. The Sudanese Central Bank, for example, claims that there are no direct U.S. exports to Sudan.
The second aspect of the sanctions is the impact on the US administration's credit lines and what it pays to Sudan. Currently, the US administration doesn't pay anything to Sudan, whether it's the organizations or the institutions.
Last May, the U.S. State Department accused the authorities of using chemical weapons against the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces in 2024. The Sudanese government, led by General al-Burhan, denies these accusations and denounces political blackmail. Since April 2023, a bloody war has pitted the general against the paramilitary forces led by Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, causing the deaths of thousands of people and the displacement of 15 million others. U.S. sanctions have also been handed out in the past against the RSF leader, whose paramilitary troops have been accused of committing genocide.
Let's ask a question now. How can Africa secure its energy future? That was the key question raised at the Nuclear Energy Innovation Summit for Africa held in Kigali, Rwanda, an event organized in partnership with the International Atomic Energy Agency and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And part of the answer may lie in nuclear innovation. Our correspondent Juliette Montilly reports from the summit.
More than 600 million people in Africa still live without access to electricity. And with the continent's population expected to triple by the end of the century, pressure on energy resources is only set to grow. One option considered during this summit is nuclear power. Civilian nuclear energy is being seen as one of the keys to meeting Africa's future demographic, climate and economic challenges.
We have not yet scratched the surface of the potential of nuclear energy in Africa. Therefore, we need to start industrial relationships, global cooperation with international institutions such as the International Atomic Energy Agency. So we put in place the necessary legal, regulatory, safety, and other conditions so that we put the foundation to build value addition the nuclear industry.
South Africa is currently the only country on the continent operating nuclear power reactors, and nuclear energy accounts for only about 5% of the country's electricity mix. But more and more African nations are showing interest and laying the foundations for future civilian programs. International cooperation is ramping up, with major powers vying for influence. Russia, through its state-owned company Rosatom, is already active in Rwanda, focusing on scientific cooperation and training. And the United States has signed an agreement with Ghana to help develop small modular reactors. One of the key innovations highlighted at the summit is precisely small modular reactors. Compact, cheaper to build, and said to carry less risk, they're seen here as a clean, climate-friendly solution to meet the growing energy needs of the continent. But major challenges remain, from infrastructure to setting up the right legal framework. These are some of the issues now being discussed by the 30 countries gathered here in Kigali, with talks continuing to tomorrow.
Now in Senegal, it's not just beauty queens that compete for the spotlight, but sheep. Crowds gathered this weekend in Guédiawaye on the outskirts of Dakar for one of the country's most prestigious sheep pageants, where the stars aren't just prized for their size, but for their symmetry, their strength, and their bloodline. The Ladoum, a native breed to Senegal, is famed for its imposing height, muscular frame, and distinctive sculpted features. Manyan Dao is a professional breeder whose 18-month-old sheep Alou won Best Junior Male on Saturday.
For me, it's a great pleasure, because before him, his father won titles. And now his son came along and has also won a title. So it shows that the lineage is a good one. And as the lineage continues to confirm its supremacy, I believe that people will want to buy the offspring.
Brilliant stuff. And finally, in a region plagued by violence and political upheaval, a rare moment of unity and celebration. Bamako, the Malian capital, hosted the first ever Alliance of Sahl States Games, bringing together over 500 athletes from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. Football, traditional wrestling and archery were all on display, with Mali dominating on home turf, defeating Niger 4-0 in a packed stadium. Despite ongoing security concerns, the event passed peacefully, with athletes and fans calling for the games to become a regular tradition. Burkina Faso finished third and will host the next edition in 2026. We've heard some reaction. Or rather, there is no reaction, but the players and the coaches very much happy to participate in these Sahel Games. Well, that's it where we end this edition of Eye on Africa. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for staying tuned. There's more news coming up on France 24.
Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith.
All the latest in politics, economics and the arts in Africa on France 24. Our journalists are in every region, every country, to report on the emergence of a continent of unparalleled riches. Bringing you Africa's stories on France 24.
Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.